"Who let the janitor in?" The question didn't arrive as a soft murmur. It was a jagged, intentional blade of sound that sliced through the high-ceilinged elegance of the grand ballroom. My brother Jonathan didn't have the decency to keep his voice low. He projected it with the practiced arrogance of a man who believed the world existed solely for his audience, ensuring his words reached every one of the 300 elite guests. I watched the immediate chilling fallout of his words. The security detail, usually a seamless part of the background, froze in a moment of professional uncertainty. My mother's reaction was more surgical. She simply turned her back, adjusting the silken fall of her gown, as if she had suddenly found herself alone in a crowded room. My father, standing beside her like a statue of old money, let out a singular dismissive scoff, the kind of sound one might make at a minor inconvenience or a fly in the wine. "The dropout child," he muttered, just loud enough for the sting to deepen. I didn't move an inch. My lack of reaction wasn't born of sudden bravery. It was the cold result of years of careful observation. I had learned a dangerous truth during the long decade of my exile. People of their stature always scream the loudest right before they lose their grip on the narrative. They mistook my stillness for the paralysis of weakness. What they failed to grasp was that this very silence, the invisibility they had spent years forcing upon me, had become the cornerstone of my independence. It had been paying my bills, securing my assets, and building my future, while they were busy looking the other way, convinced I was a ghost. Suddenly, the stagnant, perfumed air of the room shifted. A man stepped forward from the periphery. He wasn't a member of our fractured family circle, nor was he part of the hotel staff. He was a man whose presence in the city's high-stakes financial district carried significant weight. He glanced briefly at the massive digital screen behind me, which had been cycling through a slideshow of Harrington philanthropic milestones, then turned his gaze toward me. He lowered his voice, but there was an unmistakable current of genuine respect in his tone. "Miss Mary, why didn't you tell them? Why didn't you tell them that you are the sole owner of the tallest tower in this city?" The ballroom's presentation screen flickered with a sudden, violent surge of light. My name appeared first, rendered in sharp, minimalist typography that stood in stark contrast to the flowery scripts of the evening. Then the detailed architectural rendering of the tower replaced it. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the hotel, the actual skyline responded. The tower. My tower lit up in a synchronized display of sophisticated illumination, 72 floors of glass and steel piercing the night sky, right on schedule. The silence that followed was a physical entity. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of an attentive audience. It was as if all the oxygen had been vacuum-sealed out of the room. 300 guests, draped in designer silk and custom-tailored wool, stood like statues. Champagne glasses remained suspended halfway to their lips, and conversations were abandoned mid-sentence, hanging in the air like lingering smoke. No one clapped. No one offered a nervous laugh to break the tension. No one even dared to meet my eyes as the reality of the situation began to settle into the polished floor. I watched the transformation on my brother's face. The sneer of contempt that had been etched into his features moments ago dissolved into a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion. Then it hardened into something far more volatile, a frustrated, impotent rage. This wasn't the anger of a man who had been wronged. It was the fury of a man who realized he no longer owned the room, the situation, or the sister he had spent a lifetime diminishing. My mother, true to her nature, redirected her attention to the inanimate. She became suddenly and intensely fascinated by the intricate crystal chandelier overhead, then the elaborate floral arrangements on a distant table, anything to avoid looking at the daughter standing at the center of the room, with her name glowing on a 40-foot screen. Her silence was a practiced weapon, perfected over decades of social warfare. My father's expression was a more complex puzzle. The dismissive smirk was gone, replaced by a calculating stillness. I knew that look. It was the face of a man trying to decide which way to pivot. He was mentally scanning the room, trying to determine which narrative would preserve his standing. He had always been a man who aligned himself with power. Tonight, for the first time in his life, he was realizing he had no idea where the true power in this room resided. I stood perfectly still and allowed them to stare. I let the whispers begin to crawl behind gloved hands. I let the moment stretch until the atmosphere became uncomfortable, then unbearable, and finally, something approaching pain. For years, I had labored under the delusion that if I made myself small enough, they would eventually exhaust their cruelty. In my youth, I believed their coldness was a rational response to my own perceived inadequacies. I thought that if I tried harder, stayed quieter, or needed less, I could correct the failure of my existence. I had spent a decade shrinking my soul, folding my ambitions into tiny, manageable boxes, and apologizing for the very space I occupied in rooms where I was merely tolerated. But standing there with 600 eyes reflecting my success, the truth I had been too terrified to name finally surfaced. My disappearance had never been a consequence of my failure. It was the objective. They needed me to vanish so they could maintain a pristine narrative, the brilliant son and the unfortunate daughter who just couldn't measure up. The family portrait was cleaner with me edited out. The man who had spoken a banking partner, who had been a silent architect of the tower's complex financing, stepped back with a crisp professional nod. There was a genuine respect in his gaze, a far cry from the performative politeness usually traded at these galas. He had known who I was for 3 years. He had respected my request for anonymity, and tonight he had ensured that the mask was finally stripped away. I didn't offer a thank you. I didn't need to. Our partnership was built on 3 years of results, not social niceties. In all our meetings, he had never pried into the Harrington name or the corporate identities I used as shields. He trusted the numbers, the vision, and the execution. To me, that transactional trust was worth infinitely more than any public accolade. Behind me, the screen continued its cold, methodical presentation. It showed architectural renderings that transitioned into financial projections, detailing a timeline of construction that the industry had deemed impossible 5 years ago. My tower. 72 floors of glass and steel designed to redefine the city's identity. Every sleepless night spent over contracts, every calculated risk taken with capital, I couldn't afford to lose it, was all there glowing in the dark, an undeniable monument to my survival. The guests didn't approach. They were waiting to see how the Harrington name would react to this rupture in their reality. Would they embrace me as a strategic asset, or would they double down on the narrative they had been selling for 20 years? My brother cleared his throat, a sound that seemed abnormally loud in the hollow room. For a split second, I thought he might offer an apology or some small acknowledgement of the spectacle. Instead, he gripped his wife's arm and began to steer her toward the far exit, as if physical distance could somehow erase the events of the last 10 minutes. My mother followed without a word. My father hesitated, his gaze meeting mine for a fraction of a second. I saw something in his eyes that I had never witnessed before. It might have been a flicker of regret, or perhaps a sudden cold fear. I found that I didn't care enough to categorize it. I hadn't come to this party to create a scene or to seek a cinematic vindication. The truth was far more clinical. I was here for business reasons. There were connections to be maintained and conversations that required a physical presence. My attendance was a strategic move, not an emotional one. Yet I would be lying if I said I hadn't anticipated the fallout. I had chosen this dress, this specific timing, and this entrance with the cold precision of a developer. It wasn't about revenge. I had outgrown the need for that years ago. It was about acknowledgement. I had been invisible for so long that I wanted to see the exact moment they realized they had been wrong about everything. The banker stepped close again, his voice barely audible above the rising murmur of the crowd. "Your presentation is scheduled for the main hall in 20 minutes. Would you like me to delay it given the circumstances?" "No," I replied, a slight shake of my head. "We proceed exactly as planned." He disappeared back into the sea of guests. I watched him go, then turned my gaze back to the room. The whispers were no longer whispers. They were a dull roar. People were already on their phones searching for the corporate entity listed on the screen, connecting the dots I had spent a decade scattering. They thought this was the climax of a drama, the big reveal before the curtain falls. They were wrong. This was merely the first time they were forced to look at me. They still had no concept of how I had built this, why I had chosen the shadows, or what I intended to do next. They didn't understand that the woman they dismissed as a dropout was the same person who had been quietly shifting the city's financial tectonic plates for 10 years. As the shock in the room curdled into curiosity and then into a palpable fear, I realized the ultimate truth. This was never about proving myself to them. It was never about earning a seat at their table or securing their fleeting love. This was about proving to myself that I could build a life they couldn't touch, that I could stand in a room full of people who had written me off and feel absolutely nothing but calm. They thought this moment was about them finally seeing me. The reality was much more dangerous. I had stopped needing them to see me a long time ago. The grand ballroom, for all its suffocating opulence and glittering crystal, was just the latest in a long, weary series of rooms my family had decided I didn't belong in. I walked toward the exit with a slow, measured pace that masked the frantic racing of my heart. I wasn't trying to prolong the drama. I had simply learned through a decade of cold experience that rushing away often gave people like the Harringtons the illusion of victory. As I moved, the crowd parted like a receding tide, people pulling back their expensive silk sleeves as if my sudden success were a contagious ailment. I felt the heat of their judgmental stares on my back, but I refused to give them the satisfaction of a single backward glance. When the heavy soundproof doors finally closed behind me with a muffled, decisive click, the weight of 300 elite pairs of eyes vanished, replaced by the crisp, biting air of the night. I stood in the shadows of the corridor for a long minute, waiting for my pulse to level out and the adrenaline to recede into my marrow. The solitude didn't feel like a vacuum. It felt like a familiar sanctuary. This specific sense of being on the outside of a closed door, standing in the dark, while everyone important remained bathed in light on the other side, was a feeling I had been intimately acquainted with since I was old enough to speak. The first time the lesson truly took hold was when I was 19. My parents had organized an elaborate gala to introduce their children to their elite social circle, a room full of the power players who held the keys to the city's futures. I still remember the dress I wore that evening. My mother had selected it herself. It was a garment designed to be appropriate without being memorable, a shroud of expensive mediocrity that ensured I would fade into the expensive wallpaper. Jonathan, 23 at the time, and fresh out of business school, walked into that room as if the mahogany floorboards had been laid specifically for his feet. He was already being groomed to inherit the Harrington real estate empire, and he wore that expectation like a royal mantle. My father introduced him to every billionaire and investor with a palpable sense of ownership. "This is my son, Jonathan," he would say, his voice thick with a pride I had never been permitted to taste. "He's going to redefine how this city thinks about urban development. Mark my words." I stood exactly 2 steps behind them, waiting for the introduction that never quite landed. When my mother finally acknowledged my presence, she gestured vaguely in my direction with a half-empty glass of wine, her eyes already scanning the room for someone more interesting. "And this is Mary," she said, her voice dropping an octave, as if she were sharing a minor regrettable disappointment. "She's still figuring things out." That was the extent of it. No mention of my academic honors, no hint of my potential, no acknowledgement of my existence, beyond my status as a lingering question mark. The guests would offer a polite, thin smile, a brief handshake that barely registered, and then pivot back to Jonathan, as if I had already dematerialized. In that room, I learned that silence could erase a person far more effectively than failure ever could. I spent the rest of that night as a ghost, standing at the periphery and watching Jonathan collect business cards like they were trophies. My parents moved through the room with a practiced radiant grace, touching shoulders and clasping hands, weaving a web of influence that I was explicitly excluded from. I wasn't being ignored by accident. It was a calculated, deliberate rendering of invisibility. Later that evening, seeking a moment of quiet in the library, I found myself in a position to overhear a conversation not meant for my ears. My father was speaking with Richard, his most trusted business associate, the air thick with the scent of expensive cigars. "She's not like her brother," my father stated, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He wasn't being cruel, he was being clinical, as if he were discussing a bad investment in a declining market. "She isn't built for the pressure. She never has been. We're just hoping she settles down and finds something appropriate. Something appropriate. The phrase felt like a life sentence of boredom. It suggested that my entire future could be condensed into a life small enough that it would never cause them an ounce of embarrassment. I didn't storm into the room to confront them. I didn't cry. I simply went to my room, lay in the dark, and stared at the ceiling until the sun came up, feeling the cold weight of their expectations settle over me. I understood then that my family had already written the final script for my life. I was cast as the disappointing daughter, the cautionary tale that would serve as the necessary backdrop for Jonathan's inevitable success. My purpose wasn't to achieve, it was to provide the contrast that made him look brilliant. The label they pinned on me that night, "not built for pressure," became the lens through which they viewed every subsequent move I made. When I chose to study architecture instead of the family business, they exchanged weary, knowing looks. When I eventually left my prestigious graduate program to take a position at a small, obscure commercial development firm, they treated it as the final satisfying confirmation of my failure. But there was a secret I kept locked away from them. I didn't leave because I couldn't handle the work. I left because I had found something real. A woman named Eleanor Miller ran that small firm, and she saw in me the very things my family had spent years trying to suppress. She offered me a job the same week I decided to walk away from academia, and I accepted it without a second thought. I never mentioned Eleanor to my parents. I never spoke of the projects we developed or the investors we courted. I had realized that sharing my life with them was an exercise in futility. They had already decided who I was, and no amount of evidence would ever penetrate their wall of certainty. My departure from the family home wasn't a cinematic event. There were no shouting matches or dramatic exits. I simply stopped showing up for Sunday dinners. I stopped answering the phone. I moved into a studio apartment I could barely afford on my entry-level salary and began the slow, arduous process of building a life that had no connection to the Harrington name. For months, I expected them to come looking for me. I expected a demand for an explanation or a command to return to my assigned post, but the silence remained unbroken. Their absence from my life was so absolute that I sometimes questioned if they were real or if they were merely characters in a story I had invented to explain my solitude. They didn't miss me because I was the piece of the puzzle that never fit. My absence actually made their family portrait more aesthetically pleasing. Those early years were a grind I rarely allow myself to revisit. I worked 80-hour weeks for a salary that barely covered my rent. I lived in a series of cramped, drafty apartments, each one a minor upgrade from the last. I survived on cheap meals and wore clothes from second-hand shops, constantly whispering to myself that this was temporary, that the sacrifice was the price of my future. Nobody knew what I was doing. My family didn't ask, and the few acquaintances I had left from my former life drifted away, unable to comprehend why a Harrington would choose struggle over the safety of the family estate. I was alone in a way that felt physical, a constant dull pressure against my chest that I eventually learned to breathe through. But that isolation was my freedom. For the first time in my life, I could make a decision without calculating how it would be judged by the very people who had never accepted me in the first place. I could fail in private, and I could succeed without having to hand over the credit. I learned the power of strategic silence. I became an observer, a listener. I studied how the golden people operated their mistakes, their blind spots, and the opportunities they walked past because they were too busy listening to the sound of their own voices. I realized that explaining myself didn't make me safe. Being prepared did. Eleanor taught me that the most lethal weapon in business isn't capital or connections. It's the ability to see what others choose to ignore. She taught me to look at the run-down lot in a forgotten neighborhood or the subtle building code change that would suddenly unlock a site's value. She taught me to see the economic trends that were invisible to those blinded by the present. I wasn't a genius, but I had a decade of experience in being overlooked. That experience had taught me to look more closely than anyone else. I saw the gaps in the market because I had never been handed the luxury of an easy path. One evening, about 3 years into my independence, I found myself walking through a neglected corner of the city. It was an area most investors had written off as hopeless. I stopped in front of a vacant, weed-choked lot, surrounded by crumbling brick buildings. And at that moment I saw it. Not the decay, but the potential. I saw a tower that would capture the first light of dawn, a structure that would serve as the anchor for a neighborhood on the brink of a revolution. It would be the first domino in a chain reaction that would change the city forever. I had no capital, no connections, and no reputation. But standing there in the twilight, I made a vow that would shape the trajectory of the next 10 years of my life. I would build something they could never take away. Something that didn't require their permission, their resources, or their approval. They believed I disappeared because I failed. The truth was far more dangerous. I disappeared because I was building the one thing they would never be able to claim as their own. No one ever inquired about what I was doing during those long, silent years. The seasons transitioned without ceremony. I measured time not through holidays or birthdays, but by the relentless rhythm of project deadlines and the arrival of permit approvals. My life became a mosaic of small, deliberate actions that seemed insignificant in isolation, but formed a clear, powerful trajectory when viewed from a distance, a path through a thicket that only reveals its logic once you finally emerge on the other side. I eventually reached a point where I stopped expecting anyone to notice my existence. My family continued to send impersonal Christmas cards to my last known address for a couple of years, but eventually even that token effort ceased. Occasionally, a scrap of news would find me through the grapevine. Jonathan had brokered another massive deal. My parents had funded a new wing at a prominent hospital. The Harrington name was continuing its relentless climb through the city's social strata. I archived these fragments of information without a trace of emotion, as though I were reading about a corporation in which I once held a few minor, insignificant shares. My reality during those years was far from glamorous. I wasn't some hidden genius building a secret empire in a penthouse. I was a woman struggling in the trenches. I worked jobs that didn't pay enough, made errors in judgment that cost me dearly, and learned the hard way exactly where my limits lay. I remained with Eleanor for 5 years. In that time, she gave me an education in commercial real estate that no graduate program could ever match. But I also discovered that knowledge without capital was merely a map to a treasure you couldn't reach. I could identify every undervalued lot and every market gap in the city, but without the means to act, I was just a spectator. My first attempt at a solo deal was a complete catastrophe. I had identified a small property that I was convinced would triple in value. I spent months on research and projections, pitching it to every investor who would take a meeting. They all turned me down, some with polite boredom, others by simply vanishing into the ether of unanswered calls. However, failing in silence was a mercy. It hurt, but it didn't carry the public sting of being witnessed by my family. That became my mental sanctuary. With every setback and every rejection, I reminded myself that at least no one was there to say, "I told you so." My failures belonged solely to me. They didn't validate the caricature my family had created before I ever had a chance to define myself. I did have a small circle of allies, though I was slow to let them in. There was Eleanor, who gave me more responsibility than my title suggested, and ensured I was paid fairly even when the firm's accounts were lean. There was David, a lawyer who specialized in the minutiae of real estate and taught me to read a contract for the intent hidden between the lines. And there was Margaret, a banker at a small local institution, who saw through the Harrington shadow and approved the modest loans the larger banks wouldn't touch. These people didn't believe in me in the way people talk about in motivational speeches. They trusted me. They gave me work because I produced results. That transactional clarity was exactly what I needed. It didn't require me to perform gratitude or justify my worth. It just required me to deliver. The mistakes I made were many. I once bought a property with environmental liabilities I had overlooked. I was once swindled by a contractor who took a substantial deposit and disappeared. I once misread the market so badly that I lost nearly all my savings twice. each time I got back up, not out of a sense of cinematic resilience, but because I had no other choice. Returning to the Harringtons was an impossibility financially, and more importantly, soul deep. Admitting defeat meant letting them be right about me forever. The only way was forward, no matter how slow the pace. I eventually stopped asking when my life would look impressive and started asking if it was sustainable. That shift changed the trajectory of everything. I moved away from chasing the big score and focused on incremental solid progress. I bought a small apartment with a loan Margaret facilitated, not as a lifestyle choice, but because owning a piece of the world gave me a stability I had never known before. I took on the specific projects that major developers thought were too small to be worth their effort, and I performed them with such precision that clients eventually began to seek me out directly. By my early 30s, a profound change occurred. I realized I had stopped using my family as a yardstick for my worth. Days passed where I didn't think about Jonathan's latest headline or my parents' perpetual disappointment. The internal voice that told me I was still figuring things out had finally gone quiet. The silence I had built as a shield had transformed into a vast, open space. It was room to think, to strategize, and to execute without the crushing weight of external expectations. And that was exactly when my family decided to remember I existed. The first move was a text from my mother, a masterpiece of feigned, casual concern. "We haven't heard from you in so long. Are you doing all right?" I looked at it for a long time, deciphering the subtext. My mother never reached out without an agenda. A few weeks later, Jonathan called. He did not ask about my personal life or acknowledge the long years of my absence. He needed a favor, a connection to someone I had worked with, a person who had evidently become visible enough to catch his attention. He spoke with the same heavy sense of imposition he had always possessed, assuming I would be eager to be useful to him. I didn't decline. I simply let the request go unanswered. He called twice more, his tone shifting from casual to irritated before he finally gave up. The silence that followed felt like a quiet victory. They didn't miss me. They missed the access I could provide. After years of being treated as a non-entity, I was suddenly worth remembering because I had built something real. Not as a daughter or sister, but as a resource. I made a silent, unshakable vow at that moment. I would never again build anything that they could touch. My life and my business would remain in the spaces where they had no jurisdiction. It wasn't just about spite, it was about survival. I had found the soil I could thrive in, and they were no longer part of it. Those were the years no one asked about, and they were the only reason the tower could stand tall when the world finally looked up. The call arrived on a quiet Tuesday in early spring, a day defined by the gray, persistent drizzle that often coats the city during that transition of seasons. I was deep into the technical review of site plans for a mixed-use development, my desk cluttered with blueprints and red-inked revisions, when my phone vibrated. The screen displayed a number I had spent nearly a decade training myself to ignore, yet the sight of it still caused a reflexive tightening in my chest. My mother's voice, when I finally answered, was as warm and familiar as a well-worn piece of silk, carrying that specific melodic inflection she reserved for moments when she wanted a favor but refused to admit she was asking for one. "Sweetheart, it's been far too long." She began, her tone effortlessly, bypassing the years of silence. "Your father and I were just talking about you this morning, remarking on how much we miss your presence. We really should all get together. It's been ages since the family was under one roof." I listened to her weave a carefully constructed narrative of family dinners and, catching up, mentioning with strategic casualness that Jonathan's wife was pregnant with their first child. She spoke as if the decade of distance were merely a minor scheduling conflict, a simple oversight rather than a deliberate chasm I had fought every day to maintain. She sounded proud, I realized, but not me. She sounded proud of her own perceived grace in reaching out, performing the role of the forgiving matriarch to a wayward daughter. It was a social performance designed to make them feel generous without actually requiring them to change their behavior or acknowledge their past cruelty. I agreed to the dinner invitation, not because I felt a sudden surge of filial longing, but because I needed to understand the shape of the trap they were setting. Experience had taught me that it was better to know what they wanted before they found another more insidious way to invade my space. They selected a restaurant that was the epitome of old money, excess expensive, loud, and designed to project status rather than provide comfort. When I arrived, my parents were already seated with Jonathan and his wife flanking them like honor guards. They offered smiles that were practiced and thin, their gazes scanning me with a clinical intensity, looking for any sign that I had finally succumbed to the failure they had so confidently predicted for me. The dinner was a masterclass in high society superficiality. We discussed my apartment and my general health, but the questions remained shallow, designed to harvest data points rather than to understand my actual life. They weren't interested in my journey, they were measuring my current utility. The true purpose of the gathering surfaced during dessert. Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes bright with the casual arrogance of a man who has never known a no that stuck. "We're looking to significantly expand the Harrington development portfolio," he said, his tone suggesting he was bestowing a great honor upon me by sharing the news. "There's a complex project we're eyeing in the downtown corridor that requires some very specific local expertise. Dad mentioned you might have developed some interesting connections in that particular area." He didn't ask for my assistance. He assumed I would be grateful for the opportunity to finally contribute something meaningful to the family legacy. He used the same dismissive warmth he had utilized when we were children, a kindness intended to ensure compliance while reminding me of my subordinate place. I looked around the table. My mother's face held an expression of mild anxiety, her hands fidgeting with her napkin, as if she feared I might make a scene. My father was watching me with a cold, calculating stare, his silence a heavy weight. Jonathan's wife looked entirely uninvested, her gaze drifting toward the other patrons. I realized then that they didn't want my talent. They wanted my signature. They had run into the very problems I had anticipated years ago: regulatory hurdles, community opposition, and zoning complexities that required the trust I had spent a decade building in the trenches. They had discovered I held the keys to the very door they wanted to break down. Every time I had said yes in the past, they grew larger while I withered. That realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Standing in that gaudy, sterile restaurant, I saw the cycle for what it was. Every favor and every accommodation I had ever made hadn't brought me closer to their love. It had only solidified my role as a disposable asset. I put down my fork and looked Jonathan directly in the eye. "I can't do that," I said. The words were calm, devoid of the emotional charge I had expected to feel. I wasn't hurt. I was simply finished. The silence that followed was heavy with shock. This wasn't how the script was written. I was supposed to be eager for the chance to redeem myself in their eyes. "What do you mean you can't?" Jonathan asked, a sharp edge of irritation creeping into his voice. "I mean, I will not help with this project. I'm sorry it won't work out for you." My mother tried to intervene, her voice fluttering like a trapped bird. "I'm sure Mary just needs more time to think this through. It's a lot of information to process at once." "I don't need more time," I replied, my voice steady. "I've thought about it. The answer is no." The remainder of the dinner was brief and icy. My father didn't speak another word, his jaw set in a rigid line of suppressed fury. Jonathan made one more attempt to frame the request as a rare opportunity, but I simply ignored him, focusing on the water in my glass. When I walked out of that restaurant, the cold night air felt like a benediction. I knew something had shifted irrevocably. My family would remain exactly who they were, but I was fundamentally different. I had seen them clearly without the distortion of hope or the weight of obligation. I had recognized the hook hidden inside the olive branch and refused to bite. The fallout was immediate. My mother ceased her texts. My father sent a message so cold and formal it could have been written by a stranger. Jonathan took to social media to post vague quotes about the importance of loyalty, clearly targeting me. But the guilt they expected never arrived. In its place was a profound, quiet sense of relief. I had spent my entire life trying to anticipate the needs of people who would only ever value me for what I could give them. Saying no hadn't closed a door. It had shown me which doors were never mine to walk through in the first place. 3 weeks later, I received a different kind of call. It was Catherine, a woman I had worked with on a difficult community project 2 years prior. She had a proposition, a risky, complex development that would require every ounce of expertise I had gathered. She wasn't offering me a favor. She was offering me a seat at the table because she knew I had earned it through my own merit. The difference was staggering. My family saw me as a tool to be used. This woman saw me as a peer worth investing in. I didn't say yes immediately. I spent a week on the numbers calculating the risk with clinical precision. When I finally accepted, it was with the full knowledge of what I stood to lose. Saying no to my family had cost me nothing I truly valued. Saying yes to Catherine would cost me everything I had built, but that first choice had made the second one possible. I could only move forward because I had finally stopped looking back. The opportunity Catherine brought to my door wasn't the kind of project that developers bragged about at industry galas. It was a commercial lot in a neighborhood that the rest of the city's power players had long ago abandoned. The infrastructure was crumbling, the surrounding buildings were hollowed-out shells, and the community was rightfully suspicious of anyone carrying a blueprint and a promise. Most established firms saw it as a graveyard for capital. But when I stood on that site looking past the overgrown weeds and the rusted fences, I saw exactly what Catherine saw, a future that required imagination and grit to reach. The lot was positioned at the crossroads of 2 planned transit expansions that were set to begin within the decade. The zoning was on the verge of a shift that would make high-density mixed-use development incredibly lucrative. The community didn't want to be pushed out. They wanted investment that respected their history and met their needs. This wasn't an easy win. It was a project you had to survive. Catherine was blunt about the terms. She had secured partial funding, but there was a massive gap that needed to be filled by a partner willing to put everything on the line. The timeline was brutal, and the margin for error was non-existent. I spent 2 weeks in a fever of analysis. I ran financial models until the numbers blurred into a gray haze. I spoke to everyone, city officials, community organizers, contractors who knew the local ground. I looked for every possible reason to say no, searching for the fatal flaw that would allow me to walk away and stay safe. I found plenty of reasons to be terrified, but I couldn't find a single reason to walk away. I realized during those sleepless nights that I wasn't actually afraid of the project failing. I was afraid of hearing my family's voices in my head if it did. That was my deepest, most private fear. If I lost everything on this bet, their judgment would be the permanent soundtrack of my life. The dropout, not built for pressure, a failure. Their words would be the final, undisputed verdict on my existence. But I also knew that if I stayed safe and kept my life small, I was effectively proving them right. I would be living the appropriate mediocrity they had designed for me, confirming that I believed their lies all along. The 2 paths were laid out before me. One was the safe, slow climb I had been on, responsible, manageable, but ultimately limited. The other was a leap into the unknown. It meant betting every cent I had ever saved and my entire professional reputation. If I failed, I wouldn't just lose my money, I would lose the life I had painstakingly built away from the Harrington shadow. But if I succeeded, I would have something that belonged only to me. Not a small, leased apartment or a quiet reputation, but a monument. Something that would fundamentally change the city's skyline and could never be ignored or explained away. I signed the partnership papers on a Friday afternoon. There were no celebrations, no champagne, no inspiring speeches. Catherine's grip was firm and professional, and her legal team was efficient. I walked out of that conference room with a knot in my stomach that wouldn't leave for months. The consequences were immediate and relentless. 10 years of careful savings were gone in an instant, committed to the project's initial phases. My time was no longer my own. It belonged to the site, the lawyers, and the city council meetings. Every single day was a stark reminder that one significant mistake could end my career. I stopped sleeping through the night. I found myself checking emails at 3 a.m., looking for the disaster I was certain was looming just over the horizon. I lost weight from the stress, then gained it back from late-night comfort food, then lost it again when the anxiety took away my appetite entirely. This is the part of the journey they never tell you about in success stories. Success isn't inspiring when you're in the middle of the struggle. It's grinding, lonely, and physically exhausting. I had to make choices I wasn't entirely sure of and then live with the fallout. I called in every favor I had ever earned and worked harder than I ever thought possible. But then small things began to turn in our favor. A difficult permit was finally approved. A community meeting that could have turned hostile ended in a cautious handshake. A contractor actually hit a deadline ahead of schedule. These weren't massive victories, they were survival. Each one meant the project was still breathing, and my vision was one step closer to becoming reality. 6 months in standing on the site as the ground was finally broken and the heavy machinery began to roar, Catherine said something I've never forgotten. You know what separates the people who make it from the ones who don't. It's not talent or luck. It's just the absolute refusal to quit during the part that sucks the most. As I watched the first concrete being poured into the foundation, I knew she was right. That was the moment I stopped building a life they would recognize and started building one that could actually stand on its own. There was a long period during the construction phase where nothing seemed to improve, but every burden grew exponentially heavier. I can't pinpoint the exact moment I lost the ability to distinguish between days of the week. Time became a blurred, pathological loop of crises site visits and cold coffee. I had intellectually prepared for the demands of a project of this scale, but I hadn't truly anticipated how it would hollow me out from the inside. The construction itself was a constant, exhausting battle. We hit unexpected soil issues that required expensive remediation material delays that threatened our timeline and a revolving door of contractors that became my daily reality. Each individual problem was manageable, but they stacked up until they threatened to collapse into a single terminal catastrophe. The financial weight was a physical, suffocating pressure. I was operating on credit and sheer willpower. Every invoice that arrived was a high-stakes decision. Who do I pay immediately, and who do I risk losing? I knew my bank balance better than I knew my own face, checking the numbers multiple times a day, as if staring at them hard enough might make them grow. I was beyond exhausted. The responsibility to the investors who had taken a chance on me, the community that was watching with skepticism, and the project itself sat on my shoulders like a weight of lead. I woke up with problems and went to sleep with them, and the hours between were spent making choices that felt impossible to get right. There were moments when I was ready to quit. I won't hide that fact or try to make it sound more heroic than it was. I'd be alone in my apartment at 2 a.m., staring at spreadsheets full of red ink, thinking that maybe they were right. Maybe I wasn't built for this kind of pressure. Maybe the smartest thing to do was to walk away before the failure became public and final. In those dark hours, their voices were at their absolute loudest. The dropout, not like her brother. They had lived in my head for years, and I had never successfully evicted them. Every setback felt like a confirmation of their low expectations. The breaking point almost came on a Thursday in late autumn. A major supplier went bankrupt, a key community group pulled their support over a minor parking issue, and my investors were starting to sense my rising vulnerability. I sat alone in the dark, staring at my phone, waiting for a miracle that I knew wasn't coming. And then I asked myself a question I had never dared to voice. If no one ever saw this, would it still be worth finishing? It was the most honest question I had ever asked. Was I doing this for the integrity of the project or for revenge? Did I want to finish because the work was good and the neighborhood needed it, or because I needed to prove my family wrong? The answer came slowly appearing in the silence. I wanted to finish because I had given my word, because there were people on the ground counting on me, because the work was inherently worth doing regardless of who was watching. I wasn't going to quit because quitting meant wasting the trust of the people who actually mattered, people who had nothing to do with the Harrington name. That was a much better reason to keep going than any lingering desire for vindication. I didn't suddenly get a burst of renewed energy, but I did change my approach. I started to delegate more. I started to be brutally honest with my team about the challenges we faced. I stopped trying to project a perfect image of success and focused on being effective. I accepted that the project wouldn't be a perfect success story. It would be a long series of solved problems. That shift in perspective saved me. The pressure didn't disappear, but it became a tool rather than a weight. I could breathe again. A few weeks later, the tide started to turn. A new supplier was found. The community issues were resolved through a series of difficult but honest conversations, and the investors decided to stay on board. They weren't massive victories. They were evidence that I was still in the game. Those months didn't make me successful in the traditional sense. They made me unbreakable. The call was from an unknown number, a common occurrence given the sheer volume of people I was dealing with daily. But the voice on the other end carried a different weight. It was Robert Hale, a senior partner at one of the city's most prestigious and established commercial real estate firms. "We've been watching your progress on the downtown site," he said, his tone professional and direct. "And I'd like to meet with you to discuss some future possibilities." I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. In all the months of grinding and self-doubt, I hadn't realized anyone outside my immediate circle was even aware of my existence. I was too busy surviving to think about my own visibility in the market. We met in his downtown office, a space of effortless wealth and quiet power that I had always found alien. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. He had done his research. He knew about the supplier crisis, the community tension, and the financial tightrope I had been walking. He wasn't impressed by the project itself as much as he was by the manner in which I had handled the disasters. "You deliver under pressure," he said, watching me across a desk that cost more than my first car. "That's a rare quality in this industry. Most people fold when the numbers turn red." He wasn't flattering me. He was evaluating me like a strategic asset. He didn't believe in me in some emotional way. He trusted my demonstrated results. He offered me a seat at the table for a much larger, high-profile development in the financial district. It wouldn't make me rich overnight, but it would put me in the rooms I had been systematically excluded from for my entire adult life. I took a week to think it over, running the numbers with the same caution I applied to everything. When I said yes, it was a calculated move to secure my future. The change that followed was subtle but real. I started getting invited to meetings where people actually listened when I spoke. My name started appearing in conversations I wasn't even part of. It was a strange, almost unsettling feeling, being treated as an expert without having to fight for basic credibility every single minute. I kept waiting for the challenge for someone to ask for my pedigree or my family connections. It never came. Whatever Robert had seen in my work, others were starting to see as well. Success didn't feel like speed. It felt like gravity. Things that used to be nearly impossible, getting a meeting with a top-tier architect, building trust with a major lender, started to happen with a natural inevitability. One opportunity led to the next, and the project I had almost quit became my most valuable calling card. I still expected my family to reach out to attempt to claim a piece of the success they could see rising on the skyline. But the silence from their end remained absolute. Either they hadn't noticed the shift in my status, or their pride was preventing them from acknowledging what they were seeing. I heard a rumor through a mutual acquaintance that my mother had mentioned me at a charity event. Nothing specific, just that I was doing something in real estate. I saw it for what it was, a preemptive strike, a way to control the story before my success became undeniable and public. I didn't respond. Spite was part of my motivation, but it was also a strategic choice. Visibility was a privilege I now controlled, and I didn't need their acknowledgement for my success to be real. The project finished on time and on budget, despite every obstacle we had faced. The neighborhood changed fundamentally, just as I had envisioned it would years ago. The community that had once been our biggest critics became our biggest advocates, and I stayed quiet throughout the entire process. No interviews, no flashy press releases. The people who truly mattered in the city's development circle knew exactly who I was. That was enough for me. The world had noticed my work even if my family hadn't, and I realized I liked it better that way. Once you are seen for what you can actually do, you can never go back to being invisible. The text arrived on a Sunday afternoon, a time of day they usually reserved for their own social rituals. My mother's name appeared on the screen for the first time in over a year. "What have you been up to lately? I hear you've been quite busy with your projects." The words felt like a ghost of a song I used to know, but had long since forgotten the lyrics to. I waited 2 full days to reply, not out of a desire for gamesmanship, but because I needed to understand why she was reaching out now. My mother never did anything without a very specific, calculated reason. I soon discovered what had prompted the message. A major investor had mentioned my name at a dinner party she attended. He had spoken about me with genuine admiration, entirely unaware of the fraught family history. My mother wasn't checking on my well-being. She was gathering intelligence on my position. They weren't checking on me. They were checking my status in the world they valued. My reply was brief and neutral. Doing well. I am very busy with work. I hope everyone is healthy. Jonathan called the very next morning. He was all warmth and brotherly interest, his tone a perfect imitation of a supportive sibling. But his questions were a detailed map. He wanted to know who I was working with, which firms were backing me, and what my current projects were worth. I gave him nothing but polite generalities, and I could hear his frustration growing with every non-answer I provided. Then came the encounter with my father. He didn't call. That would have required him to acknowledge that I was worth his direct time. Instead, he staged a chance encounter at a charity gala I attended in support of a local housing initiative. His smile was the one he saved for high-value clients, confident and entirely artificial. "Mary," he said, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder as if we had been close our entire lives. "I've been hearing some very interesting things about your recent work. We really should talk soon. There are some family opportunities that I think might interest you." The word family was deployed as a trap, an obligation he expected me to follow, despite every bridge they had burned. I told him I was incredibly busy, and that my schedule was fully committed for the foreseeable future. His eyes went instantly cold, the look he gave any competitor who dared to say no to his demands. The pressure increased over the following weeks. My mother calls more frequently with family news, Jonathan asking for quick favors and introductions to my specific investors. Each request was a calculated way to get a foothold in my professional world to claim my success as part of the Harrington legacy. I replied to every single request with the same polite silence or vague, non-committal promises. I didn't fight them, I just refused to engage. I had learned that boundaries don't require grand speeches, they just require unwavering consistency. The dynamic had shifted completely. They were the ones waiting for me now, checking their phones for my responses. The silence they had once used to erase me was now my most powerful tool. They couldn't control me anymore, and their confusion was palpable. I didn't take any joy in their discomfort, but I did feel the reality of the power reversal. The final message of that period was from my mother, sent late on a Tuesday night. There was a trace of genuine desperation in the phrasing. "We're having a small family gathering next month at the estate. Jonathan is being honored for his latest deal. It would mean so much to the family if you were there to support him." I put my phone down and looked out over the city lights. My tower was lit up in the distance, its silhouette dominating the skyline I had helped create. They had questions, and they were starting to realize they didn't like the answers. I wasn't the one who finally told them the full extent of my success. It was a complete stranger who did the work for me. It happened at a high-level industry conference Catherine had persuaded me to attend. I was standing in the back of a crowded, ornate room during a break, half listening to a technical discussion about zoning, when I heard my name mentioned at a nearby table. A man in an expensive, well-tailored suit was talking to a small group of colleagues about the tower and the remarkable vision of the woman behind it. He wasn't talking to me. He was simply sharing industry news and establishing his own credibility by showing he was in the know. But my mother was seated at the very next table, and I watched as she heard every single word he said. I watched her face as the realization hit her like a physical blow. First came the shock, then a look of pure confusion, then something that looked remarkably like shame. She set her champagne glass down with a hand that was visibly shaking and looked around the room until her eyes finally locked onto mine. Neither of us moved for what felt like an hour. A decade of painful history was compressed into that 20-foot gap between us. Every dismissal and every slight was present in that silence. She was the first one to look away. Within an hour, the information had spread through the room like wildfire. The story was out. The disappointing Harrington daughter was actually the driving force behind the city's newest and most successful landmark. The family narrative they had been selling for years had been exposed as a hollow lie in a room full of their peers. They hadn't even known about their own daughter's massive success. I didn't confront them that evening. I didn't have to. The truth was doing the work for me far better than any shouting match ever could. Jonathan found me near the exit as I was preparing to leave. He looked a volatile mix of angry and deeply embarrassed. "We really should talk, Mary," he said, his voice low and tight. "I'm listening, Jonathan." "Not here in public. Somewhere private where we can discuss this properly." "I don't think that's necessary. Everything that needs to be said is already being said by the industry." He had no leverage left, no way to control my movements or my words. He had come to manage the situation, but he had nothing to offer me in exchange for my cooperation. "We can talk some other time," I said, and I walked past him and out the door. The phone calls started almost the moment I got into my car. Confusion demands for a detailed explanation and a thinly veiled anger that I had somehow embarrassed them by succeeding without their permission. I let every single call go to voicemail. I knew any response would just provide them with the information they needed to spin a new story. By staying silent, I left them with nothing but the raw facts I had succeeded on my own, and they hadn't even been paying attention. Their social confidence had finally cracked in a way they couldn't easily repair. The next few weeks were strange and surreal. People who had known my family for decades were looking at me with entirely new eyes. I was receiving invitations to every major event in the city, mostly designed to force a confrontation or a public reconciliation with my parents. I declined almost all of them. They weren't angry about the truth itself. They were angry that they hadn't been the ones to control it. My success could have been a Harrington success if they had bothered to look at me years ago. But now it was just mine. The truth was out in the world, and they were powerless to take it back or change its shape. The annual industry gala was an event my family had attended with religious devotion for decades. I had always found reasons to avoid it, but this year my attendance wasn't optional. My project was being officially recognized as the development of the year, and my absence would have caused more speculation than my presence. They walked into the ballroom like they still owned the room, but the atmosphere knew better. I watched from near the bar as they made their entrance. My parents and Jonathan were doing their usual social routine, but the gravity of the room had shifted. People were drifting toward me instead of toward them. It wasn't a dramatic change, but it was unmistakable to anyone who understood the nuances of the city's social hierarchy. Conversations that used to revolve around my father and Jonathan were now gravitating toward my end of the ballroom. I was introduced to the room before they were. A prominent business partner told a group of influential investors that I was the woman responsible for the most talked about and successful development of the year. My father, standing only a few feet away, was silenced by the sudden realization that no one was looking at him for a reaction. The night continued in that surreal pattern. I was constantly surrounded by people with technical questions and genuine congratulations, while my family moved in increasingly awkward and isolated circles. Jonathan tried to insert himself into several conversations, but his usual authority was gone. People were polite to him, but they moved on to other topics quickly. My mother stayed in a quiet corner with her social circle, women who clearly didn't know how to navigate the new reality. The disappointing daughter narrative they had commiserated over for years was dead and buried. The awards portion of the evening was the hardest part for them to endure. They hadn't even bothered to read the program properly before arriving. When my name was called and I walked to the podium to receive the award, I looked out and saw them at the front table, the seat their status had always guaranteed. There was no pride on their faces, not a single trace, just a cold, hard resentment. I kept my acceptance speech short, professional, and focused on the team. I didn't mention my family at all. I didn't need to. The silence regarding them said everything that needed to be said. After the awards, the pretense of a happy family was impossible to maintain. People were openly asking them how they hadn't known about the project during its construction phase. Jonathan caught me near the coat check as I was leaving, his voice low and intense. "You could have told us what you were doing, Mary." "Would it have made a difference, Jonathan?" He had no answer for that because we both knew the truth. If I had told them years ago, they would have just tried to stop me or take control of the project for themselves. I had protected the work by keeping them far away from it. The irony was that the very silence they had once used to hurt me was now the thing hurting them. Their choice to ignore my existence for 10 years was now a matter of public record. One of my father's oldest business partners, Walter, came up to us as we stood there. "I had no idea, Mary," he said to me with genuine respect. "All these years and I never knew what you were building right under our noses." My father tried to offer a response to claim some distant connection to the project, but Walter had already moved on to ask me about my next development. They hadn't lost their wealth that night, but they had lost something they valued much more, the room. And in the world they inhabited, losing the room was a defeat they couldn't recover from. The final signing ceremony was held in a private conference room with a direct, unobstructed view of the tower. It was a quiet, professional affair filled with the people who had actually helped me reach this milestone. My family was present as well, but they were seated in the back, a compromise I had agreed to, only to avoid a public scene that would overshadow the achievement. I hadn't wanted them there, but Catherine had argued that excluding them would only create more unnecessary drama. Better to let them witness the final reality as it was documented in ink. An investment partner took a moment to explain the new corporate structure to the room. In plain technical English, I was now the controlling partner of a development company that was worth more than my family's entire real estate portfolio combined. I didn't look back at them as the explanation continued. I could feel them in the back of the room, Jonathan mentally calculating the scale of his loss, and my father finally trying to understand how the power had shifted so completely and permanently. "We just need her signature to finalize the transfer," the legal representative said, placing the documents on the table. I walked to the front of the room. I took a second to think about all the dinner parties where I had been ignored, the dismissals I had endured, and the years of being told I was a failure. I picked up the pen and I signed my name. One signature, and everything I had built in the shadows was officially, irrevocably mine. The energy in the room shifted instantly. The partners and the investors all turned to me. The journalists who were present started their notes. And in the back of the room, I knew my family finally grasped the truth. That signature was the final word in their version of my story. The people in the room began coming up to congratulate me, people who would now be reporting to me or seeking my approval for their own projects. I was polite, professional, and intentionally distant. Jonathan was the first of my family to approach me. He gave me a thin, artificial smile and a firm handshake that felt like a performance. "Congratulations, Mary," he said, his voice loud enough for the room to hear. "We always knew you had it in you to do something big." The lie was blatant and almost pathetic, but I simply thanked him and moved on. Catherine whispered to me later that he was already trying to take credit among the investors for seeing my potential when no one else did. "They can have their stories," I said to her. "I have work." My mother came up next, speaking about family pride and maternal love. I gave her 30 seconds of my time before turning to a colleague who actually needed my attention. My father didn't come up to me at all. He remained in his seat, staring out the window at the tower, finally realizing that his daughter now held more influence in the city than he ever had. His empire was no longer the most significant one in the room. The room eventually emptied out as the ceremony concluded. I stood by the glass looking at the tower I had built. I had done it. Not to prove them wrong, but for the sake of the work itself. I heard them leaving the room in total silence. I didn't say another word. I had signed my name, and that was more than enough. When the final document was filed and the ceremony was over, the room itself didn't matter anymore. I walked out of the building alone, turning down the offers of celebratory dinners and parties. I needed the quiet and the open air. The city felt fundamentally different to me. I had changed its skyline, and in the process, the struggle had changed me. Winning didn't feel like a loud, triumphant victory. It felt like a deep, spiritual release. I had spent a decade imagining this specific moment, expecting to feel a surge of power or a sense of revenge. But instead, I just felt a profound lightness. The heavy weight of their expectations and their judgment, a weight I had been carrying for 20 years, had finally vanished. My phone was filled with messages I had no desire to read. My family was likely regrouping, trying to figure out their next strategic move, but I realized I truly didn't care what they did. The realization was as simple as it was powerful. I didn't need their respect or their acknowledgement anymore. I had spent my entire life chasing it, even during the years when I told myself I wasn't. But now that I had actually won by every metric they valued, I realized the prize was worthless. The night was quiet as I walked through the city. I saw other people living their lives, other families gathered in restaurants. I saw my tower rising against the dark sky, a solid, undeniable fact that no amount of Harrington spin could change. My family would never offer a genuine apology or admit the extent of their cruelty. They would just rewrite their own memories to make themselves the heroes of my story. And I found that I was perfectly fine with that. I didn't need their remorse to feel whole. Some distances are better left as they are. I thought about the struggle, the tiny, cold apartments, the projects that failed the people who actually stood by me when I had nothing. That struggle was the real story of my life. The ceremony and the award were just the final paperwork. I stopped in a small, quiet park, listening to the hum of the city. I realized I had finally stopped looking at myself through the lens of their judgment. Their opinions no longer had any power over my sense of self. If no one had ever seen my success, would it still have been worth the cost? The answer was an absolute yes, because I had built it with my own hands, because I had seen the potential that everyone else had missed, because I was willing to take the risks they were too terrified to even consider. They finally saw me that night, but it didn't matter, because I had already learned how to see myself. I looked up at the tower, 72 floors of glass reflecting the city lights back into the night. I had built that. Not for their approval, but because I was capable of it. I smiled not at them, but at the sheer audacity of the work. Then I kept walking toward my own home. The story wasn't ending. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. There would be more projects, more challenges, and more growth. My family would continue on their path, and I would continue on mine. We might eventually find some kind of peace, or we might remain as we were. It didn't change the facts. I was going to be more than fine. The tower stood tall and silent behind me, a visible landmark for anyone who cared to look up as I walked into the future I had built for myself.